Hello, everybody. Welcome back to BBB Sharing. This is Joshua, and today I have a lovely guest here. I'm going to have him introduce himself real quick.
Yes. Hello. My name is Justin Matos. Basically, I'm the owner of JM Language Services, LLC.
All right. What is JM Language Services?
It is basically it's a solopreneur language services provider, basically. It's the company through which I provide French and Spanish-English translations, basically. And obviously, I always have to clarify that there's a difference between, when it comes to translations, there's basically two types of translations.
Mm-hmm.
There are translations itself, which is basically the translation of a document. So basically, if you have a birth certificate and you want it to be translated from one language to another, that's translation. The other type of translation is interpretation. Interpretation is what you see on TV or you see at a deposition, basically, where you have someone in person verbally sort of transmitting what you're saying into another language. So, for instance, if you're with someone who's speaking like Spanish or Chinese or something like that, you would need an interpretation to translate those particular words into English so that you'd be able to understand them. So it's a translation versus interpretation.
Okay. So, Juan, try to help me understand this a little bit more. Is interpretation more along the lines of, you just can't translate it into the other language? Or is it like, I'm trying to get a good feeling for what the difference is.
Yeah, basically, it's basically a matter of media, basically. If you're translating something in print, it's translation. If you're translating something verbally, it's interpretation.
Okay, because what I'm thinking is, there's some languages where, let's just kind of take, my grandpa, he lived in Japan for a couple years before coming over here. And every time he was trying to explain certain words, he just couldn't in English because there's just some things that just don't click or just don't work or just don't sound as good in certain languages.
Yeah, pretty much the way it works is that, there's more to language than words, basically. Like, there are a few ways of explaining it. Basically, one is that, we all have taken like different public speaking courses. We talk about how it's how you say stuff that's most important as opposed to what you say. It's the same thing with language, except in addition to that, you have to also add the culture, basically. Like, for instance, us and Americans, like, we do stuff in a very boisterous and, I guess, business way, basically. So always all about being short and snappy. Whereas in other cultures, everything's all about the conversation. So, you're talking about, like, Arab populations where everything has to be about sitting down and talking about this stuff over, like, tea or something like that. And everything's long and drawn out. It's all about the relationship. That adds into language because, for instance, with Japanese, you have everything being more relationship oriented, basically. You have everything being all about harmony and getting along. So basically, what that translates to is that's basically the source of the conception that we have as Americans, that everything being about honor, everything about humility and everything like that. Since everything is so much more relationship oriented, then basically what that means is that in Japanese culture, basically what you have a bunch of expressions that come about where everything's all about, what we would translate to us as being, saving face. But basically, it's more along the lines, from my understanding, that basically it's all about making the other person feel comfortable. So basically, there's a whole lot of, in our American point of view, very superfluous phrases that come about in Japanese culture that's, really just overdoing it if you were to do it, literally in English, where it's all about, yes, I am very sorry, but I have to leave now. And then, like, you're adding, like, way too many words to that, where it's like, oh, gee, why don't you, basically probably the reason why you couldn't translate it in English is because if you were to translate it literally, not only would it not make sense because Japanese and English have two different language structures, basically, but it also wouldn't make sense because, if we were to say, probably half the stuff that you were saying, we were probably looking at them as Americans being like, okay, so is there something wrong with you? Do you not know that you can leave now? Like, I don't know. So, it's basically a key part of translation and interpretation is translating the culture as well, because you can't just always literally translate stuff.
Okay. Yeah, sometimes language just is the culture in general. I mean, language is the country, and just the area that it is.
Yeah.
But what do you see in French? Is there anything specifically in terms of like the dialect that kind of...
Yeah, I wasn't sure about your question. Basically what I see as far as differences between English and French is what your question is.
Yeah.
Is that basically, there as far as the cultural differences, French is a little bit more of an academic language, a little bit more of an analytical language. So basically what you're talking about is that, everything's all about, more thoroughly knowing what you're saying and knowing what you're talking about. So basically, everything's a little bit more analytically conclusive, basically. So, you have, of course, the differences between the use of DC versus decide, because DC in French is a lot more conclusive. But it's just, generally speaking, it's a little more analytical. Basically, the French like to read about stuff ahead of time and actually sort of make a very well-grounded and decisive choice. Whereas with American English, everything's all about, being efficient and, going with your gut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's not as, analysis-based.
Okay. What made you want to kind of go into this?
Well, for me, it was sort of just by accident. I mean, I was working at a local law firm. I guess shout out Brown Greer. Basically, and I was a document reviewer. And basically, I came across a lot of translations. And, it's an unfortunate aspect of our culture that we've never really put that much of a emphasis or that much of we've never really highlighted or known the worth of basically translators in general.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, a lot of times, which is something that we're just sort of in the middle of fighting for now with language access, is that basically in the past, we've just really made light of what translation is all about. So basically, in the past, just like now, we've always just thought that, if you were bilingual in any sort of the meaning of the word, then that means that you can sort of translate stuff. So, basically, it was with another firm, not with our firm, but basically it was, I noticed that, it was just, I noticed the translation is not really up to par because basically, what's happened and which is something that was corrected with the interpretation especially is that what it appeared what was happening was that some of the translations were basically just being translated by someone who, was just happened to be bilingual but didn't know anything about translation. So the translations were naturally very bad. So I just sort of noticed that, and it was just something that I wanted to fix. And, as being one of the few people who was not only bilingual but was also, academically trained in translation, I just sort of ended up taking on that particular project and just sort of, getting in with the rest of the translators at the firm. And, after that, I just sort of lost in and of itself just because, just always had a intellectual interest in various subjects, basically, sort of like what you would think of the French as doing. So,
okay. When you because you are bilingual in your head, if you're speaking to someone in English, out of nowhere, just someone talks to you in French, do you have two languages going on in your head at the same time, or is it just kind of a switch that flips or a compartment that you open up?
The way it ends up working is that you don't, it's different per person, but I know my personal experience is that it ends up being sort of like having different cultures that you're basically part of. Like, you may have grown up in one hometown, but you end up moving to another hometown, to another place for college, and then another place still, for your job and everything like that. It's basically having multiple hometowns. So basically, when you go to your hometown, or you encounter someone from your hometown, you basically go back in your mind to how things were when you were growing up. If you encounter someone from your alma mater, you basically go back in time to when you were in college, and you basically speak using that nomenclature. Mm-hmm. And then the same thing, et cetera, et cetera. So that's basically how it works. I know for me, especially since I do a lot of written language, like I do sometimes have that code switch lag where basically it's like, oh, that's right, I have to switch. But that's basically how it works.
Interesting. Okay. Well, how can people get in contact with you?
Oh, well, basically there are several ways because I did not like not being able to be contacted. So there is, first of all, my website, which is www.jmlanguageservices.org. Basically, it's just as it sounds in English. And the second one is basically there's my email address, which is info@jmlanguageservices.org. And I'm also on LinkedIn under JM Language Services LLC. Those are all the normal ways. Oh, and I also have a phone number, 804, 223-0024.
Yeah, take your time.
Yeah, it's 804-223-0020. Sorry.
Nice.
And then I also have an address, which is 4990 Sadler Place, number 4621 Glen Allen, 23058.
Okay.
So basically, any one of those places.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for coming in. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And anyone who's listening, make sure that you check out this podcast and others on YouTube and Spotify, BBB Sharing, Ignite Sparked by BBB. You guys enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.